All right, everyone, welcome into the lab where we deconstruct texts of the Bible to make sure that we can discover what they mean and ultimately learn how to do what the Bible is telling us to do. So we've come to Luke chapter 6, verses 47 through 49. And this passage of the Bible is a little bit unique. It's a quick story that Jesus tells at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And it's a parable of sorts. It's a pretty simple story. It's a comparative story, and it's a pretty great story for us to just take a pause and look at and hopefully understand. And so our time together tonight is going to be a little bit different, as we're not going to just break down the traditional verbs, subjects, objects, and make some sense of it that way. When Jesus tells a story, we like to make sure we understand the elements of the story, because that's really where the message is. And so anytime that Jesus tells a story, it's really important for you to ask the question, why is Jesus telling this story? Jesus always tells stories to make a point to the people that are around him, to the audience that is there with him. And if you get the context, I'll do it quickly for you here since we're going to jump into this text. But the context is really Jesus is digging in and concerned with something that I think all of us are concerned with, and that is people being genuine, people being real, people being authentic. He is concerned with people being genuine and authentic with him. He starts with a really simple question in this passage right before Luke chapter 6, starting in verse 47, where he says, "Why do you call me Lord, but not act like I am your Lord?" He's confused by something really simple. People are calling him Lord in his life, but they're not acting like he really is the Lord, the Master. It's sort of like you maybe saying to somebody, "Why do you call me your friend, but you don't treat me like a friend?" Or maybe your financial advisor saying, "Why do you call me your financial advisor, but you don't invest your money where I tell you to?" There's something not connecting here. And so the title of Lord is reserved for the one that you listen to and the one that you're willing to obey. And so in light of this, Jesus tells us a story. In verse 47, it says this. Let's read it together. "Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I will show you what he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when a flood arose, the stream broke against that house and could not shake it, because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not do them is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the stream broke against it, immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great." So here's what I really want us to do together tonight, is just look at this passage and really see there's two different people that Jesus is talking about. A story about two guys, what they do and how it goes for them. And his teaching for us is not really diagnostic, how to figure out if you're authentic or not. It's really just a warning against hypocrisy, and then a very practical teaching on how to be real, how to be authentic with him. And so let's start by noticing the similarities between these two guys. And then let's notice the differences. And in these differences, I think we'll see a pattern on how to be an authentic Christian. So let's start first of all by noticing the two different parts of the story. The first part is the beginning there, starting in verse 47. "Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I'll show you what he is like. He's like the man who built a house on a foundation." The other part of the story is about a man who hears these words of Jesus but does not do them. He's like a man who built a house but on the ground without a foundation. And so let's together quickly notice some of the similarities. The first similarity is this, that both men hear the words of Jesus. You notice it says, "He comes to me and hears my words," and then down there in the green, it says the one who hears but doesn't do them. And so the umbrella that Jesus is spreading here is not over the whole world, but he's actually spreading this teaching over just those who would call themselves followers, disciples, really the house of God. And you know, this is most often where judgment is depicted by Christ, because one of the most dangerous places to be is thinking you are right with God when you might actually not be. Remember in Matthew chapter 7, also the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus tells these people who think that they are his, "Depart from me, I don't know you." And they say to him, "Didn't we cast out demons and do these things for you?" And he says, I don't know who you are. And so we see over and over in Scripture that judgment begins with the house of God. And so he's not talking about a story between the world and followers. These two guys are examples of people who would call themselves both followers, people who hear the word of Christ. So that's similar. Both guys hear the words. Look at the next thing that's similar. They both build something. They build houses. The first man is like a man building a house. The second man hears, he's like a man who built a house. They both built houses. And so this term house is a metaphor. It's a phrase that's carried throughout all the Bible, and it means much more than just, a physical dwelling place. We see the Bible use the word house to talk about a house of God or a house of prayer, the house of Israel. He even says the house of Beelzebub in one place Jesus talks about. And then even at the end of his life, he says, "In my Father's house are many mansions." And so this idea of house is, when Jesus is using it, he's talking about a place where you reside, a place where you dwell. Your home is the place where you anchor yourself. It's the place where you find safety and comfort. It's the place that you go to after you've had a really long day. Your house is also the place where you really feel like you can just be your true self. You decorate it in your own way. You paint the walls the colors that you want to. You pick the furniture out. You set the rules for, how games are played. You've heard them called house rules, right? The house is the place where you are yourself. And the point is this: everybody resides somewhere. Now remember the context. He's talking about, who do you listen to and who do you obey? Who do you trust? This concept, or this metaphor of a home, is basically, where do you run to and where do you anchor yourself, and who do you listen to and who do you trust? When things get confusing, what logic do you use? Who do you trust? Who do you listen to? When things get really hard or you need to make a decision, whose direction do you follow? When you need to get wisdom, who do you turn to? He's saying everybody has a house that they dwell in, that they trust, that they anchor themselves into. Everyone listens to somebody and follows somebody. Why do you call me Lord but not listen to what I'm saying? Let me show you the difference between these two, okay? So both these guys hear the words. Both these guys are building a house. Both these guys also experience catastrophe. Do you see that? That the flood came up and the stream broke against both people. They both experience the same thing. And this speaks to a universal truth, that we all suffer. We all suffer. We all are going to have floods rise. We're all going to have a stream break against our house. And really, this story in this catastrophe is a story that is revealing the stability of people's homes. This is a message from Jesus about one house being stable and one house not being stable. That you're going to hit a moment of catastrophe. Everybody does. And when you hit that moment of catastrophe, it's going to reveal the kind of home that you've built. Will it stand or will it not stand? Now, this is where these two guys begin to differ. So let's look at where they differ. So we see the similarities. They both hear the words. They both build a house. They both experience catastrophe. Now let's look at the differences. The first one is this. It's really simple. The first one is, the difference is, one of them obeys the words and the other one doesn't obey the words. Notice the man in green there on your screen. It says the one who hears and does not do them. And then the guy in red up there at the top, he hears the words and he does them. So here's what's interesting. One man heard and did, the other man heard and did not do. Both of them were building houses. So the doing that Jesus wants us to do is not necessarily a building of a house, because everybody's going to trust something. What the real doing is must be discovered by seeing the differences between them as we walk through this. So we're going to look at some major differences. Let's start with the first difference. The first difference is when they were building. Notice this difference. If you look in the green there, it says, the one who hears and does not do them is like a man who built a house. Now look at the difference up in the one in the red. Here's the words and he does them. I'll show you what he is like. He is like a man building a house. Now there's a really subtle difference, but do you notice it? The man who hears but does not do what Christ said is like a man who built. He has completed at a time in the past the house that he resides in, the way that he thinks, the beings that he trusts, who he relies upon. He built that one time in the past and he has stopped building. He's no longer working on it anymore. He is fixed and figured out who and where he trusts. He's got a mindset that's already built. He's got a belief system already built, and that's set. And he built the house and it's done. Notice the tense of the verb in the beginning of the man in red who hears the words and does them. It says that he is like a man building a house, active, ongoing, still working on it. That might be subtle, but it is a significant difference. One person figured out early on in their life who they're going to trust, what they're going to think, how they're going to approach life, and that's how it is. They're not really growing or changing or developing. But the person who is willing to obey what Jesus says is a person constantly working on this, thinking about it, building, actively engaged, okay? So that's the first difference. The man who is doing what Christ wants is someone who stays active and really digging into thinking deeply about who and what they trust. But the person who doesn't really follow Christ is the one who just built it one time and is all done. Now let's look at the second difference, okay? So the man who does them and doesn't do them, let's look at the second difference, and that is what they built on and how they built. Look down again to the green. The man who heard and did not do, he built his house without a foundation. Do you see that? There's no foundation. There's nothing supporting it. He hasn't really built it upon any values or principles. He hasn't built his thinking and belief systems on any sort of core beliefs that he understands. He just has a house, might have been given to him. It was built at one time and he's done. It has no foundation. There's nothing supporting it. But the man who hears the word and he does what Christ says, he's like a man building a house who dug deep and laid a foundation on the rock. He laid the foundation. And this language begins to give us a clue to what Jesus is trying to tell us in this story. Reminds me of 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 11, where he says, "For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ." The point being is this: there's no other foundation in the world than Christ. Every other philosophy, every other worldview, every other thought and belief finds its ultimate truth in Jesus. Jesus doesn't just come and tell us interesting ideas. He came to bear witness, he told Pilate, to the truth. Our home, if it is our belief system, how we view the world, has to be built on Jesus Christ. And when it's built on Jesus Christ, it can stand against the catastrophes of life. But if our belief system are not built on Jesus Christ, it's going to experience ruin. That's what he's trying to say here. All right, let me show you the last difference. Okay, so we've got someone who does do what Jesus says and someone who doesn't. The man who does what Jesus says builds ongoing, actively his house, his belief system. But the man who doesn't build it one time and he's done. The man who doesn't do what Jesus says builds without a foundation. He has nothing supporting what he believes. But the man who does follow what Christ says laid a foundation. Now let me show you the last one. It's where they built. Okay, it says, if you look in the green, the one who hears and does not do them is like a man who built a house on the ground. The best way to translate that would be on the earth. And that phrase is telling us it's the very first thing that he saw in front of him. He just started slapping together a home. No digging, no preparing, no investigating. He just slapped together a house as quick as possible, didn't overthink it, and just got on with his living. It's impossible to lay a good foundation on ground without preparation. A house won't stand without a foundation, and you can't have a foundation without some excavating, without some digging. And so you got to actually do some work if you're going to have deep beliefs and convictions that move your life to follow Jesus. This man just woke up one day, rubbed his eyes, walked out of his parents' house, slapped together a house of beliefs on the first thing he saw without any foundation. He just didn't really do much work. Now look at the man who heard and did what Jesus says. It says he's like a man building a house who dug deep. He excavated. This is a massive undertaking. It requires the help of other people. You see, excavation reveals and exposes what you're really getting into. If you're going to build a house, I've never personally built a house, but I've got some friends who have done this, and they've had to dig into the earth to see what's under there, to see what they can build on, and you got to find and make sure they're building on something strong. And you can sometimes dig into earth and find that this is not good ground to build on. So excavating reveals and exposes what you're getting into. It peels back the layers to understand what you're really buying into. It seems like it has little to do with the actual building because nothing's going up, but it's so important. It's what's required to lay the foundation. And you notice it when you dig deep, that's where you find the rock to put your foundation on. The man who didn't listen to Jesus, who could hear him but didn't obey, never really dug deep and figured out what he should build on. He just slapped his house together and moved on. But the man who heard the words and did them dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And that foundation being Jesus Christ. And so you notice this is a story about two different people. Some similarities, but some major differences. And here is really the key thing that we have to take away. This message is a message, first of all, of warning. That second man who heard the word but didn't obey what Jesus, didn't really do what Jesus told him to do. It's like a man who just slaps together his life and just moves on and doesn't really think. He says, when the streams broke against his house, immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. You see, Jesus is giving us a message of warning. You got to know what you're believing in, know what you're buying into. You got to know why you're doing what you're doing, and you've got to be committed to it. You got to hear his words and actually do it. It's not enough just to hear it and not do it. But it's also a message of hope, because if you look at the first man, the man who heard the word and actually did what he was told to do, he obeyed him. He obeyed Jesus. He says when the floods rose and the stream broke against that house, it could not shake it because it had been well built. It's a message of hope. You and I are going to experience catastrophe. And when you do experience catastrophe, if you are anchored to the rock, Jesus Christ, and your ultimate reality comes from him, and you believe him and you obey him and you follow him, and all the way that you view the world comes from him, you will have a set of beliefs that can withstand the most tragic and difficult moments of life, catastrophe. Because when Jesus Christ, you learn that this life is not all there is, that there's eternity, and he's preparing us for that. And the main difference between these two guys is this simple statement. It says, the man who heard and obeyed is like a man who dug deep, and he laid the foundation on the rock. You see, as you dig deep and you discover the rock, you not only come to know Jesus Christ. That's really the first thing he's trying to tell you to do, is when you dig deep to lay a foundation, you got to come to understand Jesus. He is the rock. He is the foundation. But you also come to discover who you really are, your true self, your authentic self. I love how Isaiah chapter 51 verse 1 says it. It says, listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, you who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, and to the quarry from which you were dug. You see what he's trying to say there in Isaiah 51 is when you discover the rock and you understand who Jesus is, and you build your life on him, what's so beautiful about that is you actually are beginning to learn who you really are, because you are cut from him. He's the rock from who you were hewn, and he is the quarry from which you were dug, that you and I were made in his image. So as you understand Jesus and build your life on Jesus, you discover your true self, because you were born and come from him. So I want to encourage you to dig deep, to think deep, to discover the rock on which you should build and lay the only foundation of your life, and that foundation is Jesus Christ. Everybody is going to have a house, a place that they trust for wisdom, for insight, for decisions. And if you're going to be a person who's going to have a house that can stand and not fall, you've got to dig deep, understand and see the rock, and lay the foundation on him, on Jesus Christ. And if you do that and obey what Jesus is saying, you'll have a house that can stand. Sure hope this time together in this passage has been helpful to you, and I pray that you will have a blessed week. Take care.